I'm here.
Good evening, everyone, and very soon happy Sabbath, and welcome to our evening youth seminar this evening. We'll make a short introduction into the topic of this evening. But before, I will let Benjamin, who is the youth leader in Glasgow Church, to introduce a little bit the topic, and also I think the Glasgow youth prepared a special item for tonight. Benji, are you with us?
Yeah, good afternoon. May I ask whoever is got their mic on, because I can hear myself back, to mute themselves. But yeah, good evening, everyone. Today we have our equipping seminar, which will be led by Pastor Gifford Rhamie, or should I say Dr. Gifford Rhamie, to use the appropriate title. But before we start, I just want to ask us that we bow our heads as we pray. So let us pray. Father in heaven, Lord, I want to thank you for everything. I want to thank you for allowing us this opportunity to share together, Lord, and to learn a few lessons, Lord, that we can take away with us, especially in this 21st century. You know what's been going on over the last year, Lord, the pandemic. And the pandemic has magnified some of the challenges that we face as 21st century Christians, Lord, and believers. I pray that you continue to guide us, and I pray that you do be with Dr. Rhamie, Lord. May this be a productive evening. May we learn and may we come together, Lord, through what we are about to hear. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Before we go ahead and start, I would like to share a special item, and the special item will be coming from Glasgow Church, and it will be done by one of our musical talents, Rhamie Imbiba. So if you just give me a few seconds, I'm just going to share the special item.
I've sinned, fell short of your glory, messed up, ain't proud of it, but your love is more than enough. And you keep on keeping me, yeah. I don't know why you never left me, I'm not sure. But through it all, Lord, you kept me, and I'm here by your grace and love. Said you keep on keeping me, oh, you keep me, oh, never let go. You keep me safe in your arms, no danger harms me. Keep on keeping me, keep on keeping me. You keep on keeping me, you keep on keeping me, keep on keeping me. Say, oh, you keep me, oh, never let go. You keep me, me safe in your arms, yeah. Oh, you keep me, whoa, you never let go. No, let go. You keep me safe in your arms. No danger harms me.
So that was a special item from Rhamie Imbiba. We managed to put it together a bit last minute, but I hope you enjoyed it. Now I'll just pass over to Pastor Claudio, and he will give us a few words for and introduce our guest speaker for tonight.
Thank you very much, Benji, and thank you very much, Glasgow Youth, for your introduction tonight. I would like to say welcome to everybody who joined our Zoom link, and also to those who are watching on YouTube link. The topic for tonight is facing a post-pandemic church. We all agree that the pandemic has changed for good, not just our society, not just the way we operate, but also our churches. there were some big shifts in the society, and the church is part of it and has to respond to it. And tonight, the first kind of challenge that would like to address is the challenge of equality. How do we translate equality? Is equality a biblical principle? Is that what God wanted? Do we find equality in the Old and the New Testament? How do we translate equality in our society and in our church? And for tonight, we invited Dr. Gifford Rhamie, who is professor at Newbold College. And I know Dr. Rhamie has been for a couple of times in Scotland, and he spoke at different youth events. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Professor Rhamie. And we'd like to give the mic to you for the next, I don't know, 1 hour, how long you want to take, and then we'll have some question and answer session. And we are praying for God's blessing for the next minutes when we listen to you. You are muted. You are muted.
Good evening, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Happy Sabbath to you. Through the Shetland Islands all the way down to the border of Scotland. I bring you greetings from southern England, and I trust that you are well. It's always a joy to be with my Scottish brothers and sisters, especially my young people, and I pray that as we share together tonight, we will not only stimulate conversations amongst us, but that we will be motivated to do something about our time, especially in these days of our church life. So I want to thank Pastor Popescu for allowing me to have this platform. Thank you for your invitation, Pastor Claudio. And without further ado, I'm going to move forward. I'm going to share screen. Is that okay? And by all means, you can use the chat. I won't be able to look at the chat that much, I must confess, because of the nature of the presentation. But we will see how we get on. Okay. So I'm going to cut right to the chase, and I am going to be open and frank with you because this was the basis upon which Claudia and I actually engaged, and he wanted me to talk about race in the church and equality, or race in society and equality. And we have been subjected to a lot of ideas about race and notions about race, and it has been challenging for all of us, especially in the wake of George Floyd's death last year. And it's amazing that his death has sent not only shockwaves across the world. Why? Because we saw the actual lynching, some people call it, for 8 minutes and what was it 46 seconds, and because of that, people began to ask questions about inequality between the races. And even in the corridors of our churches, maybe your churches in Scotland, and maybe in your homes, you have been having conversations about race and the church's attitude towards race. Now, needless to say, the Bible considers us as one race. So Acts 17:26 reminds us that we came out of one blood, out of one race, so to speak. So as far as the Bible is concerned, and all the way up until the 1500s, it was considered that there was one race, and that is the human race. And so where did this notion of race come from? The races come from? Why do we refer to different people from different parts of the world as not only having different ethnicities but having a different race? Why is that the case? Well, I want to talk a little bit about that. So the idea is that I'm going to give a little background to race as far as Britain is concerned, and then I'm going to talk about um, uh, immigration and how that has inflected the way we think about race. And then I'm going to talk about race and the church, and particularly in the British context. And the idea of doing this is so that we have a background, we have an understanding of why things are the way they are and what can we do about it in response. So let me begin by talking about Britain on the world stage. And I don't know how you feel about the George Floyd incident. Was it this week? Yeah. The verdict was given, and the police officer who murdered him was found guilty and on 3 counts. And I don't know how you feel about that, but many people were holding their breath because they thought, as at other times, the police was going to get away scot-free. Why is there this antagonism between people of different races, so to speak? Well, let's talk about Britain on the world stage, since we are here. Now, you know about the transatlantic slave trade, which began really in earnest in the 1600s, towards the late end of the 1500s and the beginning of the 1600s. And here is a map of the African enslavement and the transportation, the brutal transportation of enslaved Africans to different parts of the world. The majority of them landed in Brazil, and some in the Caribbean, and some in North America. So primarily the Americas was the place, and this went on for some almost 300 years. And what was interesting about the transatlantic slave trade was that Britain and Europe did not see many enslaved Africans. The enslaved Africans were all abroad, and this meant that Europe had a very sanitized view of the enslavement of Africans, because they didn't see that many, so to speak. And the few that were in Britain or in other parts of Europe were mainly servants, and some were actually bought their freedom, and they were part of the fabric of British society and European society, to the extent that some even were part of the royal household. And we know this to be certain. We know that at one stage, Queen Elizabeth I complained that there were too many Africans in London, for example. That was her feeling, because these were free Africans, so to speak. But so for Britain and much of Europe, the enslavement of Africans were mostly happening in far distant places abroad. However, in 1833, Parliament got a conscience and they outlawed slavery. And the law took effect in 1834. 800,000 slaves were free. What was interesting, though, is that the slaves were not paid any reparations. So even though they were made free, they were not given compensation, so to speak. Instead, the compensation and the reparation were given to the slaveholders, the masters, and millions of pounds were paid to the masters for their loss of labor and their loss of income through slavery. And that is why today, for instance, you might have heard talk about reparations. There should be reparations, and there's a huge discussion about that, both in America and here in Britain. Having said this, yes, it was very much in the past, but we must never forget that the past in many ways define our present. And that is because after the enslavement period, Britain and other Europeans colonized the different countries. So it was said at one stage in the late 1800s that the sun never set on the British Empire. You can see from the distribution of countries here, the purple patches refer to the British Empire. Even North America was a purple patch at one stage, if you remember your history. And if you can imagine the globe going around, the sun never set on the British Empire. This is impacting because the church was very much inseparably engaged in the quest of colonialism. And the state church was used as a catalyst for this. Missionaries were known to be sharing the gospel in different parts of the world, let's say on the African continent, different countries there, they were sharing the gospel. And the mercenary were doing their jobs of ensuring that people were subdued, and that people were doing what they were told to do, so to speak. And the consequence of this was that in the evenings, it is said that the missionary and the mercenary sat around the fireplace in a far-flung country, drinking tea and sharing how did the day go. This is further complicated because the Queen is the head of the church, and so the way the church is organized in Britain is very much inflected by the colonial past of the church. So it's difficult to think about the Church of England, for example, without thinking of its colonial past. And its ties to the Commonwealth now, since 1945, is really, in a sense, a surrogate type relationship or reflection of the past. We know the church in Britain has a very hierarchical ecclesiastical structure, and we know the church has a parish model, i.e., different neighborhoods are organized around churches, and because of that, the priest has a very signal role, not as much today, but certainly back in the day in the life of society. I'm deliberately mentioning this because I'm going to come back to this point when we talk about church later on, the Adventist church later on. So England has always has existed as a unified entity. There were always wars and so on, but as a unified entity since the 10th century. But the union between England and Wales began in 2084 and was formalised in 1536. But what is of note is that in 1707, England and Scotland agreed to join as Great Britain. And this was before England was a state or Scotland was a state. Notice, however, that before their union, they were already empires. England had colonies, and Scotland was doing missionary work in these different colonies before 1707. So before the Union, before Great Britain existed as an entity, England was already an empire. I think this is quite significant. So notions of empire is very much in the blood of the nation. And this, in many ways, characterizes the way others are seen, especially if they were part of the colonies or other foreigners. So people like myself who was educated in 70s and 80s, I had what one could call a very classist education. So part of the education ideas to remind us that we must keep our place and so on. But my parents, whom I'm going to come to in a moment, who were from the Caribbean, they came to this country in 1960, they had a colonial education where they knew more about Britain than they did even their own countries. And this is not exceptional. This was right across the board. So I made the point that Britain was no independent nation. They've never been an independent nation, no island nation. England, or Britain rather, has always been connected with other countries in some form or measure. Now I want to move on to the discussion of identity and how the notion of whiteness is very much an identity of Britain and mainland Europe. Why whiteness? I didn't invent this word. Sociologists didn't invent this word either. The notion of white came about as a result of defining the other. And I haven't got time to go right through this this slide, but here you will see different times or iterations when whiteness was created in order to describe oneself contrastation to the other. So the first time this was muted was in the middle of the 1400s. The Ottoman Empire was ruling the roost at the time, and Iberia, which was Spain and Portugal, Iberia was ruled by Africans for 800 years, and the Pope Pius wanted to free Iberia from this imperial rule, so that the Catholic Church can reign once more. And so they were losing uh, all the Ottomans, who were, the Turkish folk. Europe was losing primarily because Europe was fighting amongst itself. There were wars between the European people. You could say nations. I'm hesitant to say nations because nation is actually a technical word. The word, when we talk about nation state, for example, the idea of a nation state came very much later in the 1800s. So Italy, for example, was not a country, a nation state, until the mid 1800s. Before then, it was just different cities ruling. Like, you remember, for example, almost 2,000 years ago, we had the Roman Empire. Well, it wasn't the Italian Empire; it was the Roman Empire, and that's because the city of Rome was the city state, so to speak, that ruled the roost. And this is the way Europe was run, by different city states. But because the different countries or people of the countries were fighting each other, the Ottoman Empire was reigning supreme, and Pope Pius decided that he was going to galvanize Europe as one against the Ottoman Empire. And this was the first time that Europe was conceived as an entity. And he used both the idea of religion, he was primarily Catholic, saying that we are one people because we believe the same God, we have the same religion, and the Pope, of course, was powerful, and around the idea of race, that we are the fairer race. And this was, and we see some of this idea coming out in in British language around Elizabethan time. But this, mind you, the word. So as with any concept, these things took a while to grow and to be understood as accepted reality, or as such. But of course, we know in the art world it was portrayed even from the 12th century and onwards. And then with the expulsion of the Moors, the African Moors and the Jews in 1492, and later on the expulsion of the Moriscos in these were the converted Christians in 1609. The idea of whiteness was by this time firmly hold in the imagination of Europeans, at least the elite in Europe. And so when Columbus, for example, got lost on the Atlantic and accidentally found himself in the Americas, he, again, in order to distinguish himself from the heathens and from the savages, as the Pope gave him permission to cite or to name them, the idea of white was conceived there too. So you can see whiteness is this floating signifier that happened at different incidents at different times in different places, until it was galvanized as a thing. And it was galvanized as a thing when enslavement of the enslavement of Africans began. So the notion of white was conceived before the notion of black. All right. And the reason why whiteness was conceived before blackness was to, again, construct the idea of a justification for the enslavement of Africans, to suggest that Africans were not actually fully human beings. So some would say they were 2/3 human beings, some would say they were 50% human beings, but they're not quite human beings. And so by demonizing the other in this way, what happened was it gave people the excuse to dehumanize the other. Now, this has only happened around color or race. Let's be clear about this. This has happened between ethnicities. When we talk about in Rwanda, for example, it was the same kind of logic going on. This kind of racial logic, calling the other despicable names around, from the insect world and so on. They are cockroaches and so on. And when you start naming people in this way, it gives the masses the false belief that they are treating not equal human beings, but they can subjugate the other. Now, I'm obviously going over swathes of history here. So you know that this is backdrop. This is the backdrop of where we are of our world, of this part of the world today. So in the Christian imaginary during the Age of Discovery, was a phrase that was coined in America to justify the subjugation of the indigenous Americans, the Indian Americans, or some would say them, and it became a theological trope because it was felt that this age of discovery was an age of education, an age of enlightenment, an age of civilization. And this all was predicated on the idea of creation and the idea of land. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was born in the late 1800s, was probably the first sociologist to actually define whiteness in this scholastic way. So he's the one who academically described it, theorized about it, and suggested its power. He actually called it a type of religion. And his idea was the creation of whiteness was the death of blackness, because whiteness is this false idea of supremacy, the supremacy of one over the other. And we see this happening in the partitioning of Africa. Some people refer to it as the scramble of the scramble for Africans in Africa. This was at the Conference of Berlin between 1884 and 1885, where Africa was partitioned artificially into countries. And those of you who are of African origin would know, for instance, that the artificial line or boundaries between countries sometimes even split people, people of the same ethnicity. And so Africa, for example, was carved out by Europe, and to this day we are experiencing the results of that. Okay, to this day. So I'm not sure if there is an African nation that that is not controlled or heavily influenced by not only multinational companies, but by different countries in the West. And we can talk a little bit about that later on if you wish, if you want to ask me more questions. So the motivations for colonialism was economic, was religious, and was cultural. And economic because of the enormous resources of Africa. To this day, it is said that Africa has the resources that can not only feed the rest of the world, but provide the metals that we need, the gold, the energy that we need, the items for our watches or for our phones. So there is, there has, because of the wealth of Africa, there was motivation to subdue Africa, but it was also religious as well, and this was hand in hand. The need to spread Christianity was seen as an imperial quest, was seen as a civilizational quest as well. And then there was the cultural, which is highly connected to the economic and religious, where the idea of civilization was seen as one poet referred to, burden. Okay, so this is Professor Dubé, who is a theologian, and she's from Southern Africa, and she talks about colonialism as a way of damaging the African psyche, but also of defining Christianity. And so in many ways, she and others would say Christianity is colonial. So the type of Christianity that we have today is a colonial Christianity, because Christianity was from its very root in Europe, that is Constantine, in the way that Constantine conceived of Christianity in the 4th century, all the way through to the Enlightenment period in Europe, was always had blood, always was mingled with blood. So Christianity was always fronted by the sword and shield, not just the Bible. So I thought I'll just give this as a backdrop, and I think it's important to state this. Some people want us to ignore it or forget about it, but we have to live up to it and say, well, this is our past. How does it actually construct our present, and how could we dismantle ourselves from the stranglehold of the past, at least the cyclical logic of that brought about the past in the way it did. So I want to talk about coming to Britain now, and Britain as a multicultural society through settlers and immigrations. And in so doing, we're going to talk about our Adventist context. Just checking how we're doing for time. There are primarily 5 waves of Adventist settlers and immigration, or settlement and immigration. So in the 1940s to the 1970s, a lot of West Indians came to Britain. As I alluded to before, these were colonies of Britain. They were part of the British Empire. And so my parents, for example, came on British passports. They were actually British, so to speak. And I suggested to you before, my parents knew more about Britain, their history, the kings and queens of Britain and Westminster and so on. They knew more about that than they did their own history, and this is quite significant, as we will see later on. They were invited to come by post-war Britain because of the destruction during the war and the need to rebuild Britain. And some came for feeling that it was going to be a better life for them, not anticipating the racism that they met when they came. Then we have in the 1980s, and I'm generalizing here, but in the 1980s and 1990s, we had a few Indians, beginning in the 70s, but mainly in the 80s, from Africa in particular, from East Africa, the Indians came. And a lot of the Ghanaians that came in the 90s did not stay. They came, got educated, and went back. A few of them stayed. Sorry, I should say that from the 60s and the 70s, a number of Ghanaians or West Africans were coming to Britain. I'm referring specifically to Adventists, but they did not stay. They tended to go back. But in the 90s, the Ghanaians, again from a former colony of Britain, but this by now they were part of the Commonwealth, and they came and they stayed. And the same pattern we find with East Africans and Zimbabweans themselves. And notice that most of the motivation for coming was for coming for a better life in the mother country. These peoples spoke English because of colonization, and they were taught that the mother country, Britain, was paved. The streets were paved with gold, and they would be welcomed with open arms, and they would have many opportunities. And as we see today with migration patterns, people tend to follow the money, right? And in many ways that dictated why people have been coming to Britain. And then, of course, in the 2000s and the early noughties, we saw Eastern Europeans coming because they joined the EU. And then in the 2010s, we've seen more South Americans coming. So this is a general, you can see here, general waves of immigration, to the extent that that the church, the Adventist church today, is described by many as an immigrant church, or peopled by West Indian settlers, and so on and so forth. I say settlers advisedly, and that's because, strictly speaking, they were not immigrants when they came, because they were part of many of them. So there's always been a long history of immigration. Did you know that? So here you see the Cheddar Man, who's said to be, I think it's 10,000 years old. That's what they say. This is the oldest bones, if you please, that's found on British soil, and the construction of him is that he was actually a black man. And the same thing with the woman. This I can't remember the name of this. I have it somewhere, but she's said to be 5,000. Her fossils are meant to be 5,600 years old or thereabouts. So as you can see, there has always been because it's an island country. It's always been subjected to waves of different kinds of immigration. So I talked a little bit about the immigration, and on the right, the table here, you'll see the different types of immigrations that Britain has been subjected to. Okay. So my point really is that Britain has always been a multicultural place, and has always been peopled by newcomers, and this didn't just happen with the Windrush generation. My parents' generation is referred to as the Windrush generation, primarily because the first major boat in 1948 that brought a lot of people here was called the Empire Windrush. That's what the ship was called. It wasn't just since then. Britain has always been subjected to different kinds of waves of settlers or migrants or immigrants, and because of that, it's hardly the case where it's hardly the case where you'll go somewhere in Britain where you will not find someone from somewhere else. It's just a fact. So this is a picture of the Windrush when my parents came over, for instance. I thought I'll just put that in. And this looks at some of the challenges that they met when they came, and I want to emphasize that much of the reaction of the local people, of the natives here in Britain, were as a result of the imperial past, the way they regarded other people from the empire, or other. So, for example, in the early years of the 1950s, we know that 128 Polish migrants came after World War II, and there was not even a whisper in the newspaper about them. If you look at the newspapers back then, there wasn't a whisper about them, and if there was, it was saying that we should welcome them, and in fact some homes were leafleted about how we should welcome these people who suffered during the war. However, in that same period, only 17,000 Caribbeans came. So there's a huge difference between 128 and 17,000, for example. 128,000, 17. And when they came, along with the Irish, they were told no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. That was in the windows, and many people, and they were called many names, and they were not welcomed as such. Of course, not by everybody, because the story goes that as far as the Adventist church is concerned, the white natives were very hospitable towards the blacks that came from the Caribbean and other places, very hospitable. But that kind of changed, I think, later on when the numbers grew. And maybe we could talk about that later. So this just talks about the process, and what it was like for immigrants in Britain back in the day, and how, as a result of this, insurrections and riots were caused, and this impacted the way we live. And however, it should be said that there has been an effect on the church as a result of people coming from abroad, and and these questions I raise are often around questions of belonging. Do we belong, or do you belong? Do you sense that you belong? Is this church, do you sense that this church is yours, for example? So, for example, and it's, you know, and it's true. People from the global north are different from people from the global south in many ways, not just in skin color. So, for example, our regard for time, you know, European conceptions of time is very different to the global south conception of time. So chronos, for example, defines very much the European conception of time. We need to start on time and we need to finish on time. All right, and that's understandable, of course. Whereas, and this is defined by chronos, whereas kairos defines very much the global south way of looking at time as qualitative. Well, it doesn't matter what time we start, it doesn't matter what time we spiritless. Once we're having a good time, it doesn't really matter. And we come across this, don't we, in different ways in our churches, and we have to kind of iron things out and sort things out. That's major. I mean, we laugh about it, but it actually is major when you think about how that affects or has a knock-on effect, a sort of domino effect on other aspects of life. And so when we talk about people coming together, it's not easy, it's not straightforward. It's having to negotiate different worldviews and different practices and different ways of looking at things. And how do you do that in one place? How do you do that in one church where people have these different conceptions of time, when they have different conceptions of individualism or collectivism, or the individual or the group, or the nuclear family or the extended family? You know, in some countries where extended family is the norm, they don't have words for cousins, for example, in their language. We have words for cousins, but they don't have words for cousins. They refer to them as brothers and sisters because this is their concept. And even uncles and aunties, they don't have concepts. They call them dad and mums, or second dad or second mum, and so on and so forth. So the conception of family is even different. What do we think, and how, and is what versus how should things be done? How does this impact our worship etiquette and our fashion and our styles? These are very, very important questions. I'm coming towards the end now, but these are ideas I want you to just throw out because it's all historical. So the impact on Adventism. In the 1970s, there was a period of discontent. And now we talk about Black Lives Matter, for example. And the period of discontent, this is what the church looked like in 1953. The population of the British Union was 7,257. There was a smattering of West Indians, but on the main it was primarily a white British church. And then you see how the numbers changed, and things took off in the, you know, once we hit the 1957 mark. Here it's 1960. Then you can see the membership of Britain growing almost exponentially. All right, and this happened with respect to the ratio changed between blacks and white during this time. So by 1970, there were more blacks in the church than there were whites. 50 years ago, isn't it? Wow. Today, it's estimated that the church now is about 80% or thereabout black, and of the 20% white, they are many of them are Europeans. When I say Europeans, forgive me, I'm talking about post-Brexit, Europeans, mainland European. So again, the makeup of pastors has changed considerably. So what now? What we're finding now, as a reaction to all of this history, is that there are four major types of churches. Adventist churches. We have the traditional churches. These churches are plateauing. They're not growing hugely. A few of them are. A lot of them are not. And then we have language churches. These are we have quite a few of them now. We have languages around Tree for the Ghanaians, Swahili for the Eastern Africans, the East Africans. We have Portuguese-speaking churches, Spanish-speaking churches. We have Russian-speaking churches. We have what other? I don't think we have a Filipino-speaking church, but we have Ghanaians, we have Nigerian-speaking churches, and some of these churches are still growing. Romanian-speaking churches. Some of these churches are still being planted. That's what I meant to say. So the language churches are growing exponentially. So I used to pastor in Reading, for example, and I used to be the pastor of the Reading district of churches, and there were two churches. One of them was a Caribbean traditional church, and the other was an African traditional church. It wasn't a language church because there are different Africans, East, West, Central, and Southern. Now there are 6 churches, I believe, and of the 6, I think 3 of them are language churches, and they are growing. They are literally growing. And then you got the few white Anglophile churches. There aren't many of them now, and they are even changing in complexion as I speak. And this is a phenomenon that's happening because many of the white British members who were in the church, especially for generations, that they are getting older, and they are dying. And then, of course, we have a few, not many, church plants that are around the simple church model. And this is where churches, I'm not referring to the cloning model where you have a branch Sabbath school as a church plant. I'm referring to a church plant that is intentionally planted to attract community members. We have a handful of those, not many, and they, in some measure, are making inroads into the community. But alas, we don't have enough of those, in my opinion. So who are we baptizing? We are generally baptizing people who are coming over to this country. Those are immigrants. We are baptizing other Christians as well. So come out of her, my people. We've got this strong, there's a strong evangelistic thrust to reach people from other denominations for some reason. And then we baptize some of our children, and And we are also baptizing returnees. These are people who left the church and decided to come back. These are the four main groups of people that we are baptizing. Have you noticed that we are not baptizing on the main? We are not baptizing British indigenous people. And British indigenous people or indigenous British people, I'm referring to black, white, and Asian. So people who were born here, been here for generations, we are not reaching those people. Okay, so this is significant. Okay, so what must we do? I believe our challenge is to take on the Acts model. So I have this presentation where I talk about the book of Acts, and I talk about the book of Acts in these 6 ways, and these are the 6 things that we find happening in the book of Acts. People are integrating because of Pentecost. They're listening, they are observing, they are respecting, they are participating. What we also find is that people are joining others, and they are joining others whom they don't like. I want you to note this. So the people of God in the book of Acts are joining people they don't like. And by joining people that they don't like, they are being sought, and they are thereby winning these people over to Jesus. I think that's quite a significant move, and you see this right throughout the book of Acts. They are learning the languages, the mores, the idioms. They are decentering imperialism. That happens all the way throughout Acts. The imperialism of the Jerusalem church, and in many ways the imperial Rome. And today I would translate that as we need to decenter white supremacy because of its historical past, and patriarchy, which is based upon the abusive power of men. And in the book of Acts, we find that the pastor is the pastor of the community, not just the synagogue, or not just the local church in our context. And we also see love. There's love for people. There is indiscriminate love for people. Okay, I'm going to end here, I think, because I think that we can do I think the future is bright. I think there's so much that we can do in spite of our past. And we must be emboldened to know that now that once we have this sense of belonging, we belong here. Where you are, those people are your people. And by the power of the Almighty, you can actually win them over. Join them and win them over to Jesus. I will just stop there, Pastor Claudio. Is that okay?
It's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rhamie. That was a mind-blowing history lesson. I can't remember having it in Newbold, so I'm picking up now. It was really, really informative.
And this is an abbreviated form. It's an abbreviated form.
Okay. I mean, yeah, excellent. I mean, I was learning so many things. I felt like an ignorant sitting here, but yeah, it was really informative. Thank you very, very much. And I hope the other ones who watched this presentation were also blessed by it. Now it's time for questions. So guys, those of you who are on the Zoom and felt intrigued by any points of this presentation, now is the time to ask your questions. And I would like to also add that those who ask the question should switch on their video camera so we can see your
Yes,
face.
please. Yes, please. Don't shout all at once.
Exactly. Who wants to fire first?
Can I ask a question?
Could you raise your hand, guys, so I can see it? Yeah. So Benji first, please, and then who else wanted? Chloe then. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, my question was more revolving around the end bit that you said. You said that, and of course, a lot of us have already aware of it, that there's churches being planted or are already there where they're specific to certain groups, certain people from different countries. And understand, as immigrants, when we come here, we don't immediately know English. So these churches are very critical. They're needed. But also, I feel like sometimes some of the churches, like you said, that some are being planted that are traditionally West African and ones are traditionally East African and so on. But so I feel like even with amongst ourselves within the church, we're already segregating one another when Jesus called us like to be one like him in the heaven and his Father are one. But by building these branches, I feel like my perception has always been that aren't we like doing what our past, what we complain about, we're doing it within the church as well?
It's a very good question, and I think it's very pertinent and relevant. So thank you for asking that question. It's a complex question and complicated, and I just want to, if you like, tease the layers off so that we can see the complexity of the question. I actually believe that the greatest show of humanity on earth is when you see people created in the image of God coming together in spite of their color, in spite of their language, in spite of their cultures. And if they come together in one as a unified entity, I think to me that's the greatest picture. That's the greatest picture. It's almost like heaven if you think of that ideal picture. But that's a very, very difficult picture to reach. And just saying, I believe in God and we believe in the same God, it seems as though that's not enough. It seems as though that there are other things that we must do if we are going to not just meet and worship together and live with each other, but cohere and be at one with the other. So two things. So that's my ideal. All right. So that's what I feel is the ideal. I do think, however, that the Holy Spirit works with our situation, and if the situation is of such that it's easier for whatever reason for people of the same ilk to worship together and to band together and to grow together in a safe context, then I think the Holy Spirit will work with that situation. And I think that is what we are witnessing to some extent in our different language churches. Because a number of them would say when they came to the main churches, they were not welcome. Well, if they were welcomed, they were not noticed and they were not integrated and they were kept on, they were almost permanently treated as visitors or as guests, even though they might have been worshipping in that church for 18 months. Some don't know that their names were not called out and they just didn't have the sense of belonging. And so they felt, well, I can't do this anymore. I can't do this. And so they worshipped with their own folk, and there the church took off. So I understand the need, as you quite rightly pointed out, Benjamin. I understand that need that that people prefer to worship in their mother tongue, yes, and they because in their mother tongue it's not just words, you know, it's not just music, it's cultural it's cultural practices of naming, of respecting certain groups of people, of groupthink and that sort of thing, and I think it's perfectly okay for that to happen. However, research has shown that by the second generation, it's difficult for the young people to stay in those churches, because those young people tend to want to identify with the majority culture. And hence there is this tension often between the second generation and the first generation immigrants. And whether in Britain, the research shows that in Britain, one of my students did a research some years ago of a similar phenomenon in Sweden. So there was a Finnish church that came over in the 50s, and they banded together and they worshipped together in Finnish. But by the second generation, you know, they wanted to be with the majority Swedish population, and that church had huge problems staying afloat as a church because the young people were leading. And I've seen this with my own eyes here in South England also. So I think I think what needs to happen is that we need to be mindful of these trends, and we need to paint the vision of God ever before our people. I don't think we do enough of this. I think we need to accept our differences and celebrate our differences and acknowledge the belongingness, if you like, of our differences, across our differences. But we don't do enough of that. We assume that because we worship the same God, because we have the same beliefs, everything else will roll together. I hope that is a beginning type. I'm beginning to answer your question. I probably have thrown up more questions than answers in so doing, but I'm trying to help you to see that it is a complex question that you've asked. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That has helped, and I completely understand about not being seen in a church. When I first moved down to SEC, nobody knew who I was, and they still treated me like a visitor for months.
There you go. There you go.
Chloe,
so a church that doesn't do that. Mm-hmm. I was just about to say, the church that actually recognizes you on the get-go is a church that intentionally does that. You know, they have to have a pastor like Pastor Claudio who organizes, you know, key individuals to look out for the visitors and to make them feel welcome and so on. That has to be intentionally done. If you leave it to just the reflex of members or the instinct of members, it would hardly ever be done. So this sort of thing needs to be organized, and that's why I said there needs to be this intentional vision that's always cast for the church. Yeah.
Thank you. Chloe, and then John. Chloe, I see your hand up. Are you there?
Sorry, I was muted. I was on mute. Can you hear me?
Can we see your face also?
Unfortunately, I can't put my face on right now. Yeah, sorry, Pastor.
An exception, Dr.
Pardon?
Yeah, we'll just have to, you know.
Okay.
We'll just have to go with it.
Yeah. So my question was based on the numbers you kind of showed, and on how. So when I was in England, and one of my flatmates asked me a question as to why our church is predominantly Black.
Mhm.
And obviously the SDA church now has been almost labeled as the Black church.
Mhm.
And I remember as well, I was in Paisley, because my church is Paisley Church.
Mhm.
And I was walking around, and I remember somebody, I think I was work, I don't know, but somebody asked me a question and asked me if I go to the church in Paisley. I was like, yeah. I was like, oh yeah, I've seen you there before. I'm like, yeah, that's awesome. And there was a rumor going around that apparently they do not administer people in the church if they're not Black, because the church was predominantly Black. So in a sense, like they do not take on people that are non-Black. And I see like that's like such a major issue within, especially with our area being quite small, and still us being Black people, other ethnic minorities still being the minority in itself, but yet the church being predominantly Black. And I see that sort of like almost raising issues on how we minister to people and how people come to the church, even though we do door to door and things like majority of the outreach we don't do it for Black people. That's the thing, like they do not even turn up for the outreach. Majority of the outreach, the people that we minister to are, the minority of the community, which is white.
Yeah.
And for the church to still be predominantly white is very Black is very questioning, and a lot of people are having issues based on the questions that I was asked. So how exactly should the church ensure that there is sort of like an equal number of people? I don't know how to put it exactly, but to show that we are not a church that is only catering to one specific ethnic group, but rather we're a church that caters to everybody else, in spite of the fact that the church is predominantly Black. And I see why based on the numbers that you gave. So I have a different experience of church compared to my dad, because when my dad moved to Glasgow, the church was predominantly white. To then us coming here and the church moving to Scotland, and the church is actually predominantly Black. And that is always shocking for visitors that come from different areas, especially coming to Scotland. So how exactly should the church behave, or what sort of ministry are we to have for us to reach other groups of people that are not of the one specific ethnic minority group?
Yeah. So the very fact that you took a long while to ask that question, and you asked it in many different ways, demonstrates the complexity of that question. It's not an easy question, you see, and that's why you sought different ways to ask the same question. So I'll answer in a couple of different in a couple of ways. One is, the fact remains that the church is 80% Black or thereabouts. The Blackness of the church is not homogenous. By that I mean, it's not one monolithic whole. It's not just, we are not all the same Black people. So there are differences within the Blackness. There's a sort of multiculturalness, if you like, within the of that church. So because we are one color, or seemingly so, it doesn't mean that we are of the same culture. All right. So your question needs to have that nuance. The nuance is that even though we are 80% or so Black, we are made of different kinds of Black people, and that's fine. All right, that's the first thing. The second thing is we are in a context where the majority culture, which is white, have a particular kind of history, and a history that elevates their civilization, and it's always going to be difficult for the average white person to just simply see a black person at the door and just take on board what they say, and so on and so forth. It's always going to be difficult, because wrapped up in the relationship is the historical past. So we cannot negate that, all right? that though that is the case, the challenge with many of our black brothers and sisters is to actually learn the culture that they're in and to appreciate the differences that they are in the culture. And I don't think we do that very well. Okay. So it's one thing to say, well, we do witnessing here and we go door to door, whatever the case may be. Yeah, we probably do that because that's what we did back home, wherever home was. Right. But the British way, the white British way, is not necessarily that way, you see. And I fear that a lot of us want them to be like us in our cultural way, and that's just not going to happen. All right, I'm generalizing, of course. So we have to do what the actors in the book of Acts did, what Peter did, what Paul did, and that is we've got to join people. And so for many of our folk, this is quite challenging because some of us come from a theology that says we shouldn't join people. Some of our theology is caricatured as we should leave people. You know, come out of her, my people. Babylon has fallen. You know, when I was growing up in church in London, I remember being told by the person who gave me Bible studies, preparing me for baptism. I remember being told that, you know, once you're baptized, you've got to leave all your friends behind. You know, you can't associate with your friends because they will contaminate you and they will lead you astray. So there is this fortress model of doing church that we have, where we once in one season a year we go out with our fishing rods and we fish with people. And then once we get people in, we bring them into the church and we close the door and we bolt the door. And there's several bolts, you know, with padlocks on them because we don't want them to actually join. And we tell them, you know, Jesus said, you know, father, you know, brother would leave father and so on and so forth. And we even tell them to leave their families alone. Well, in the book of Acts, we see something else. We see the people of God joining others whom they didn't like, whom they weren't used to, who led very different lives to them. Some of them were told to join the imperialist people who had very much an imperialist background. So think of Peter, who joined Cornelius, for example. And Cornelius was a centurion. He was somebody who represented the Roman Empire. And Peter was Cornelius would be the last person Peter would want to join. And we know that because God had to really knock him on the head, didn't he, with a vision, and, you know, with the hanging basket, and say, look, you've got to mix. You know, these people are one with you, and unless you join them, they're not going to join you. And so part of our challenge, I would say, Chloe, is that we ought to learn to join people. And that's why I've kept this page up, so that we can go where people are and we can join them and just be friends, just mingle and be friends. Be friends because they're human. Don't be friends because you just want to win them to Jesus. Just be friends because they're human, you know, and you will find that your Christianity will be infectious. Your Christianity will be transformational for them because you have joined them through with the power of God. So and only then will things begin to change. So whether I mean, whether we're called a black church or a white church or a mixed church is in one way neither here or there. The point is, what are we doing? What are we giving evidence to? What if friend looked at you, what they say about you as a Christian, as a representative of Adventism, you see, and they should be saying, well, if they're like you, I want to join. I want to come. That's what they should be saying, you see. Yeah. And don't get hung up on these things. The Christianity is on the main decline, and it's not growing. It's only growing where immigrants are or where new types of people are. That's where the church is flourishing and growing. So let us use our energies to enable the church to prosper in this way. Yeah.
Thank you. John, I see your hand.
Yes, thanks, Gifford, for your presentation from a Black racial perspective. But I was pleased that you've touched in the questioning on the cultural issues that obviously are significant that we need to address. And I'm speaking obviously as one of the ethnic minority in the church, but who, like Christ, who was really about mingling, building relationships, and then meeting their needs. And like Paul, who was to the Gentiles, I'm a Gentile, to the Jews, I'm a Jew.
Yeah.
How do you think we should be actually achieving better outreach with people like myself, who are the majority population in the UK? The cultural differences are obviously significant both within the church, entirely different style of worship to what I was brought up to. So you would find that many of those we're trying to reach have an entirely different style.
Yeah.
And then when you get into things like lyrics of modern songs, Christian songs, which are more likely to attract young people out with the church, then, obviously these are cultural issues which need to be addressed, not only within the church, but out with the church as well.
Yeah, thanks for raising that. And I can only answer that by my own experience. I mean, there are theoretical answers to that. But I will give you a couple of experiences that I've had where change in terms of reaching the majority population has happened. So we do have a few cases of that in the Adventist Church. So, for example, there's a church in London that has that is a church plant now. And I advisedly say that because, John, I actually believe that the way to do this is through church plants. It's difficult for churches to change their ways. It's just difficult for that to happen. So we can preach to them till the cows come home, and they will always reach people like themselves, which is fine, all right, but in their efforts to do it differently, it will hardly ever happen, because we are creatures of habit and we are creatures of our own cultures, all right? So two experiences. One is, before I tell you about the church, I was given Bible studies to 3 white individuals a few years ago, and they knew I was a lecturer, but they knew I was a theologian, but they knew I also was a preacher, and they kept on asking me, say, Gifford, when can you take us to your church? And I would say, and I would always fob them off by saying, well, yeah, I think, yeah, we need to work out something. I would really like to do that. And they would leave it alone. And then a couple of months later, they say, come on, Gifford, you said you were going to take us to your church, right? And in my head, John, I'm scratching, which church should I take them to? Have you ever had that? I don't know if anybody else has had that, because sometimes you go to church and you have what I call the cringe syndrome, where different things happen in different churches, and you cringe and you say, well, if friend was there, they will either laugh at me or walk out. I'd be entirely embarrassed by what's happened. And so I was trying to fish around to figure out which one can I go to, which one can I take them. Anyway, I decided there was one church that I was going to take them to because I preached there 18 months before and I had a fab time. It was a fairly modern church. Everything was planned and prepared. And for those of you who may not know, I'm a musician, so I'm keenly alert to these things. And the last time I was worshiping with them, they changed the service completely. They had 5 guitarists who were playing, but they weren't playing the same thing. So one was playing, this was drumming, the other one was a bass, the other one was king, and it was just beautiful. And they played different items. It was just magical. It was amazing. I thought, yeah, these young folk could come to this church. And when I got there, I thought, uh-oh. And the cringe thing took over. I remember the pastoral prayer was a sermon. I remember the children's story was a sermon. The woman who went up there, I want to tell you about colportering, she said. Colportering, those were the words she used. And the children weren't even listening to her. And she was really, pitching her. She was trying to tell the church off, it was one of those. And I sensed that when I got up to preach, and I kid you not, even I felt that I was a breath of fresh air. It was just against the grain. So I remember asking my friends, so what did you think? What did you think? When we got back in the car, we were driving off. I said, so what did you think? And one of them said, can I tell you honestly what I thought? And I said, yeah, of course. And I was smiling to my friends. And then she said, it was rubbish, man.
One of the cultural differences is other sermons. If you can't get your message across in 20 minutes these days, because of the attention span of a very modern society, then forget it.
Yeah, but she said it was rubbish, and I laughed out of sheer embarrassment. All right, and when and I said, why? Then she said, is it always like this? And I said, yes, because this church was full. It had 300 people in the church, and I made the mistake of saying that there were 50 people in as an overspill in the other room. And the other person went, really? And then the third person said, so haven't these people got anything better to do? So they thought that because of the quality of the church service, the people who were attending church were wasting their time. And they couldn't believe that these people who were highly educated people spending 2-3 hours in church and sitting through sheer mediocrity. All right. And I was sharing this with a friend of mine, and my friend said to me, cool, my mum had a similar experience. She invited her white neighbor to a church, and when the son asked the neighbor, so how did it go? He said, oh, that was 3 hours of my life I won't be able to get back. All right. So these are some of the realities. Okay. We think we're okay because what we tend to do, we sit through the mediocrity, and so how was church? We'll say, oh, it wasn't too bad. The children's story was okay. Or we might say, well, I got this message from the sermon. So we do put up with mediocrity as a habit. All right. So that's one. And the second one I want to tell you, I think the answer is church plants. You've got to plant new churches with new people. And this is what's happened in one particular neighborhood. They went into I will say, a highly middle class district, and they started off as a very small group, and everything was intentional, everything was planned. It was simple church, meaning that they didn't have special items, that sort of thing. They didn't have the paraphernalia parts of worship. It was just basically praise and worship, or singing, an offering, a sermon, and that was it, really. And one of the core ministries that they started was a community choir, and they put the advertisement out to the community. It was just to the community, and to this day, the community choir is about 75% community, and these are white folk from the community. And this is partly because the one thing a lot of white folk are attracted to when it comes to black people is gospel music, and they use gospel music as a way of reaching, of doing outreach. But there's no forcing of members to become members, or these choir members to be baptized or anything. They are, in fact, the choir members are helping running the show. And they've done the same thing with regards to their homeless ministry. So they have a homeless ministry, and people from the community, different sets of community, and they are helping to run that ministry. So there's a sense of belonging by the folk who are coming. There's no them and us sort of thing. And people are being baptized. I'm talking about white people are being baptized in this outfit, but it has to be constantly intentional, because what tends to happen in the Adventist church, the president might say, "Okay, it's time to shuffle the pastors around." And what happened? The pastor who had that ethos of intentional integration and intentional outreach to keep church in such a balance, and it's the delivery of the service in such a way that it will be attractive and appealing to the majority of culture. It only takes another pastor to come who doesn't have that, or who hasn't got that sort of thoughtfulness, and the church ends up looking like the pastor. So so it's a challenging question, but I do believe church planting is the way forward.
Thank you for that, Gifford. Thank you.
Any other questions? I saw Ashley earlier. Ashley, do you still have a question, or anybody else? I see a question on the YouTube. Well, Charles has to make up your mind. But I see here, is there any difference over generations? Do kids of immigrants behave differently to the first generation immigrants?
Yeah, there's a major difference. So what tends to happen with the first generation immigrants, everything is new. The culture is entirely new. The ways of thinking and doing are entirely new, and they tend to look for support amongst themselves if they are that fortunate enough. And immigrants to Britain, at least, tend to be fairly traditional in their Adventism. I'm not criticizing the traditional, I'm just saying that's what tends to happen. And they meet a church or a culture that is a little bit more liberal than what they're used to. They think it's very liberal, but trust me, the Adventist church is not a liberal church by any stretch of the imagination. We think, those of us who might think some people are liberal, you ought to just get out there and see what different churches are really like. But these things can be quite of can be a culture shock, and what tends to happen is that they tend to support each other and look for each other, and they tend to want to reproduce their Adventism of back home. So this could be Romanian, this could be, I preached in a Romanian church a few times, and I've preached in Romania, in Moldova before, and it's the same, same format, same, everything's, and that's what happens. We tend to reenact the back home way. But what happens after that is that if your children are born here and they start going to school here and they start integrating with the cultures here, their accents are different to yours. The music they listen is different to yours. Their education is different too. They tend to want to blend in more in the majority culture, and the consequence of that is they become alienated from their own parent culture. And I'm generalizing, there are a few exceptions to this rule. They become alienated from their parent culture and their parent way of doing things, and they find church very old-fashioned or very passe, and they tend to want to leave church. If you're fortunate enough, they will find a church where there are young people like them or like the majority culture, and they will stay in those churches. But often they leave church altogether. So it's not because they don't believe in God anymore. It's nothing to do with believing in God. It's about belonging. They don't have that sense of belonging anymore. These language churches need to be mindful of those trends. You see? So it's one thing to have language church, that's fine, but they must know what to anticipate. They must anticipate the change so that they can adapt to that change. One way around it, I know one church in the London Ghana church, for example, the way they have gotten around that, it's almost out of default or out of particular circumstances. I don't think it was out of design, but they have a separate service for the young people because all of the people can't fit in the main church. So they have a massive hall, and the young people have a separate church there. And because the young people are leading worship, and they're running worship by young people for young people, that is a very vibrant, very, very vibrant space. And many young people, even from other churches, come to that church to worship. And so maybe that's a second lesson that we need to learn, and that is, if we want our young people to stay in church, you've got to let them lead. I'm not saying give them responsibility. I say let them lead. Let them lead. Yes, it's going to be different to the way you're accustomed to. It's going to taste different. It's going to sound different. It's going to look different. Just get over it. Let them lead. They are spiritual just as we are. They have a different way of articulating that, but they are as spiritual as we are. So, and that's our challenge, I think. That's our challenge. That's a huge challenge.
I think we got accustomed to a certain model of doing church, and we expect the same thing over and over. And every time something new is tried out, some have an overreaction, and that's where sometimes we stumble. Anyone else? 5 more minutes, guys, for questions. Come on. Anyone else?
This is your chance.
Exactly.
Ask me anything.
Off limits.
Other questions?
Somebody's unmuted. Let's see. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll just ask, I think another question as an extension of the one that I asked before. Obviously because of the pandemic, not because of the pandemic, but the pandemic has magnified and exasperated issues that were already there. So it's not like they're issues that were never there.
Good.
And a lot of questions that people, or a lot of young people have been asking in terms of like the whole cultural aspects and the way the church tackles things like racial issues is, are we doing enough? I know the BUC made a statement after the whole George Floyd incident. They put out a statement, but for a lot of people, it felt like, let's make a statement for the sake of making a statement to show that we are fighting, when in reality it seemed like we weren't doing anything. So the question is, what can the church do? How far can we get into these issues while still maintaining like a stance of like love and everything, without seeming like we're trying to side with one area? I'm not trying to say that one aspect is bad, one aspect is good.
Sure.
It's hard to verbalize the question, but that's the thing.
Oh, I got it.
I've been hearing a lot ever for the past year.
Brilliant question, and now we're getting to brass tacks. I wish this was the first question, and that you set a trend of questions, because really this is where the rubber meets the road. Thank you for that, Benji. The issue with the church making statements is a serious one. And that is because there are some entities that did not make any statements. Let's be clear about that. So we are thankful for the ones that did say something, especially since our young people were talking so much about it. Some of our young people were joining the protests in the streets, and I was applauding them to just go out there and stand up for justice. And the church we haven't got a very, at least in recent years, we haven't got a very strong record when it comes to standing up for justice. This is very different to the church in its pioneering years. I don't know if you're aware of this, Benjamin, but the church in its pioneering years, yes, I'm talking about in the time of Ellen White and her peers, was a very social justice church. It was a church that stood up sometimes against the law of the land, in favor of the people of the land. So our early pioneers were abolitionists, and by that I don't mean they just they didn't agree with African enslavement. They fought actively against it. We know of our leaders against the law actually held fugitives. These are slaves who had escaped, and they actually protected them. So they were card-carrying abolitionists, right? That's in the genes or the DNA of Adventism. They were card-carrying members of the Temperance Society. The Temperance Society was not just a health society, and we're very pro-health, which is excellent, but it was also a pro-woman society. A lot of people don't realize that, and they were card-carrying members of women's rights and so on. Over the years, that side of the church has somewhat diminished. And I should back up and say, in those pioneering years, they saw their role as a prophetic church. The sort of rationale they gave behind protesting, protest against these societal ills, was one of prophecy. They would talk about Revelation 13 and 14 in light of the African enslavement, in light of the abuse of women, and so on and so forth. So, but we lost that prophetic edge, and I think There is a movement now across the church, I'm sensing amongst at least the young people and some of the older ones, that we need to rediscover our roots, and we need to stand up against the injustices of this world and not be ashamed about that. Unfortunately, as I said, we haven't got a good track record. We were the last to say something about apartheid. We were the last to say something about the Rwandan genocide. We were the last to say something about the inter-Yugoslavian conflicts. We were the last. You see, always the last. So we tend not to be able to be good at this, and this is because along the way somewhere we said church shouldn't get involved in politics, and we mistook politics with a big P with politics with a small p, and we lost our way in that sense. Now, one of my students wrote his master's dissertation, just finished it this year actually, where he looked at the George Floyd protests, the aftermath of that, and he wanted to know what were the young people talking about, and what was their conversation, and what were the older people talking about. And he realized in his research, field research, that the Adventist young people's conversation around race and around justice was very different to the conversations that were going on in the pulpit and amongst the older generation. Very different. So the young people were talking about this, you've got to call a spade, and we need to stand up and we need to be counted because these injustices have gone on far too long. And especially given that most of these young people are people of color anyway, and they were saying, no, we need to link up with our brothers and sisters across the street, and we need to show some kind of solidarity there. Even my own children, older children, were involved in this, all right? So that's on one side, but in the pulpits, you would never have known that there was a George Floyd incident. And in the Bible studies and in the conversations that the older church members were having, they just weren't there. So there is this generational divide. And I think we need to learn something from the conversations of the young people today. I think this is part of the question. This is party to the question that I think it was Chloe that was asking, what can we do to reach out? I think we need to start having conversations. Our conversations need to tally with the conversations that are in the streets. We can't be talking to ourselves in a different language. And so we talk about Jesus is coming soon, but we talk about that to ourselves, and we use all these cliches, and we just can't talk to the common person. I teach homiletics at New World, which is the art and science of preaching, and I tell my students, I don't want you to use Adventist cliches. I don't want you to even use religious cliches. I want you to preach a sermon without mentioning the mighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. With that, I want you to talk about, preach a sermon without talking about amazing grace. Talk about grace in a different vocab, and we just can't do that. You see, because we're so used to talking to ourselves. And one last thing I would say to that is. We will find our prophetic voice again when we actually stand up and speak against the injustices of this world. Why do I say that? Because prophecy in the Bible consistently, whether it is forthtelling or foretelling is when you're prophecy referring to present circumstances. Foretelling is when you are, kind of predicting the future. Whether it was foretelling or forthtelling, prophecy in the Bible was consistently against the injustices of this world. You can't talk about prophecy without talking about injustice. But somehow we have managed to do that here. You know, I don't know how we did it, but we have managed to talk about prophecy without talking about the injustice. Prophecy is prophecy because it talks against the injustices of this world. So I want to applaud you, Benjamin, for thinking along these lines and wrestling with these ideas. And I want to exhort you to people around you, Adventist young people, and have these conversations around you, and to do something, be activists, do something to demonstrate your love for people. It is said that justice is what love looks like in public. And if you want to show love in public, don't be afraid to speak truth to power. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's really powerful, really powerful. A friend of mine is texting and saying, you know, is this stand up for justice not somehow linked to present truth also?
Yeah, absolutely. That's how present truth was conceived. All right. We need to preach and speak to our circumstances, our present circumstances, and don't duck the issue. Do not duck the issue. I feel so. One of the outcomes of the research was some young people are disaffected with the church because they feel that the church is simply out of touch with reality. That's a huge indictment. They feel that we're out of touch with reality. We are not speaking to present. We're not we are not speaking truth to present truth. We're just not.
Are some injustices that we notice in the society a bit taboo for church, where we say, you know, we shouldn't be involved into that? That's just, you know, not Adventist enough to stand for that, because, you know, we see, you know, for example, gender, right? Discrimination, racism, right? Okay, that's the one that the society speaks about. We feel kind of, yes, we have to address that. But when we speak about gender, all of a sudden we become a bit quiet.
Yeah.
When we talk about gender, and we become even more quiet, and sometimes we don't know what to do. It's not our business. Politics is not part of who we are, our DNA. So we better don't talk about. So how do you see that?
It's simply because we don't have the conversations ourselves. It's a bit like saying to going over to a complete stranger and saying, you know, mate, you're overweight. You know, you're overweight, mate. You know, now what right do you have to tell that person they are overweight if you don't speak to them? You've got to be friends with them. You've got to know them. And by being friends and knowing them, then you're able to say, you know, you're overweight, mate. Well, we've got to have friends. We've got to join people. We've got to have these conversations in our own corridors, in our own front rooms, and talk about these things. But we're not even doing that, you see. And so if we're not even doing that, how on earth are we going to go out and join people and talk about these things there? So this is why I applaud you, Pastor, to invite me and other people to talk about some of these things, because these conversations are simply not being had enough. They're just not being had enough.
Just the last question for tonight. I got it from somebody who wants to be anonymous. And the question is, can you ask a question on my behalf, please? Do we have room in our churches for LGBT young people? Historically, we have not. How does the future church navigate through this and reach out? Has the effects of young people in our churches and can cause them to leave, as this has been the pattern in the past?
Yeah. And again, it's because we don't join people. So it's always easy to criticize people when they're different from us, all right? And when we're across the street, because that's what happens. And we even preach about it, for goodness sake. We condemn people whom we don't even know, all right? And we make questions, well, the Bible says this or whatever. And we don't even know people. But when you know people, it's a totally different ball game. And I think we need to stop labeling people in these ways. I think the reason why we label people is because we want to say they are different to us. That's why historically, that's how colors came up, because people wanted to distinguish one race from another. All right, and then create a hierarchy of races. But we do that with sexuality as well. We label people. Why? To say that they are different to us, and hence they are lesser than us. All right, and it's important that we don't see people in terms of their labels, but we see them as human beings, and we embrace them first and foremost as human beings, as John earlier said. He quoted 1 Corinthians 19, where Paul talks of, no, sorry, 1 Corinthians 9, where Paul talks about to the Jew, I became a Jew. Well, how Paul become Jew, and he's already a Jew? Have you thought about that? To those under the law, I became under the law. To those outside of the law, I became. How did he do? What was his concept? What was his concept of identity, and what was his concept? And I believe what Paul was basically saying was, I am first and foremost a human being, made in the image of God, and so are you, and so is everyone else. All right. Do not condemn that which you do not understand. Be with people. Join people, and you will see something very precious and something very, very different. And I know a couple of contexts where churches are creating spaces for people from the LGBTQ community, creating spaces of belonging. That is, and my wife says to me, when I can't figure her out, she will say to me, Gifford, stop trying to understand me, just love me. And I think some of that has to happen. We need to just start loving people and let God do the rest. Just let God do the rest. Benjamin, you want to say something on that?
I wanted to say one last thing. I know this is just one last thing in terms of the political side that you were talking about. Like, I often get frustrated. I'll just give two examples. First example is the 2016 European referendum, when we were voting on whether to leave or remain. I had a lot of conversation. A lot of young people were saying we shouldn't be involved in politics because the Bible has already said the European nations will fall, they'll go this direction. And that really frustrates me a lot.
Yes.
And another side, I was born in Rwanda during the genocide.
Wow.
And my family had to leave the country because of that.
Yes.
So when people say that we shouldn't be involved in politics, I find it hard to digest, to swallow, because I feel like, yeah, I know political power can corrupt character, but I feel like as Adventists, as people of God, we should have voices in some of the highest places in society.
Absolutely. And the people of God in the Bible did as well. Let's be clear on that. All right. We have characters in the Bible who were big time players in the politics of their countries. And, there are some countries, let me just say, where Adventists do profile in the higher echelons of society, in government. So the Prime Minister of Jamaica, for example, is a card-carrying Seventh-day Adventist. He goes to church every Sabbath. All right. Did you know that? He's the Prime Minister, the highest office in the land. The Governor General of Jamaica. And this is, if it was a republic, he would be called the president. So he's like the Queen's representative on the country. He is a Seventh-day Adventist. In fact, he was a Seventh-day Adventist Union president. He was the Union president when he was asked to serve as Governor General. And we have people in government as ministers serving. And so I believe we can be a force for good in these corridors, in these spaces, and people like you, Benjamin. I will vote for you every time. So absolutely, I agree. I concur and agree with you on that. On the matter of about prophecy and so on, it was funny because I do remember vaguely when we were joining. What was it then in 1973? Oh, I can't remember what it was called then. Not the EU. What was it? John will say. He would say. But I remember people were talking about the prophecies then. We shouldn't be joining because of prophecy. I know that every president of the United States of America is elected. Some people believe, well, he's going to be the one who's going to enforce, and we get bogged up in this. Can I just say, we've got to be careful about the way we fixate prophecy. Very, very careful about this. Ellen White warns us against that, and she's on record saying prophecy is not fulfilled until it's fulfilled. In other words, you will never know often what the fulfillment of a particular prophecy is until it has been fulfilled. So you can't just be speculating here, there, and everywhere. And as I mentioned earlier on, prophecy pertains to injustices anyway. All right. And last thing about prophecy is not just about Europe. All right. Europe is a small part of this world. All right. Prophecy is about the whole world. Why are we so fixated on a Eurocentric interpretation of prophecy? So there's a lot to think. There's a lot to think about there, right? So think on these things. Think on these things. But
Wow.
thank you for that. Yeah.
You opened the Pandora box.
I don't know how much time we're going to have with you,
Yeah.
Pastor Gifford, because I'm also getting a lot of other questions. So I don't know if we have enough time because there's
what I can suggest is that we finish formally now, and I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes and to entertain your questions. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Be okay. Yes. Let's formally finish now with a word of prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And those who want to stay longer for another 10 minutes, they can stay. Is that all right?
Yeah.
May I ask you, Dr. Gifford, to give us...
Let's do that. Father in heaven, we thank you for the cadre of young people that we have in Scotland. We thank you for the earnestness of their love for you. And we want to lift them up to you again and ask, Father, especially those of them who are studying, that you enable them to persevere and to do well and to try and be their best. And those who are working, to see their workplace as a place of joining, as a place of sharing. And for those who are struggling and looking to get on a course or looking to find a job, I want you, Father, just put your hands upon them and step into their future and clear the way for them so that they can realize their own potential. We are Seventh-day Adventists, and we belong to a movement that believes in a world that is lived through not only in the physical, but in the spiritual, in the mental, and in the emotional. And as we seek to live as harmonized whole beings, we pray, Father, that our witness will be such a draw to other people, irrespective of their color, their race, irrespective of their language, irrespective of their sexuality. May we have be such a force for good that when we join others and talk to others of Jesus, and thereby derive a peace that passes all understanding. So may we continue to have an enjoyable Sabbath in your presence and amongst each other. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. I just want to say thank you to everybody who watched us so far. Thank you, Professor Gifford Rhamie, for being with us and accepting the invitation and reminding us to keep a balance between being heavenly minded, but not becoming of no earthly goods.
Yeah.
If we get into an extreme. And those who want to stay another 10 minutes for some questions are welcome to stay.
Yeah.
Should I close the live stream, Claudio?
Yes.
Yeah. Please.
Okay, yeah, that's